are still in there, okay? Just FYI. Okay, we'll get underway quickly because I've got quite a bit to get through. And where are we? Let's share my screen. Applications. Okay, there we go. Is iClicker 2%? Ooh, I've just lost that thread wherever it went. 2% of the achieved grade. It'll be in that ballpark, okay? Somewhere between less than 2 to 3% is my guess, okay? Based upon how we, you know, when we put it all together, number of questions and things like that, okay? 3 of the lowest 3 will be dropped, yes, of iClicker. And 1 of your assignments will be dropped as well, okay? Jolly good. So hopefully you can see this. Yes, this screen here. This today will be your easiest iClicker point ever, by the way. And then I'll finalize iClickers after that, after today. Okay. First thing I want to do is to point out is that I've just organized the lecture section. No iClicker next class. Yes, correct, Edward. I've organized the lecture section in Blackboard. What I've done is I put the last lecture up, we'll do on Thursday, and that'll actually be the ecosystems lecture, okay? That'll be it. That'll be the last one. We won't have time to get to the last one. And I've also organized all of the lectures so that all of the ones we've done before that are not in the final exam, I put in a folder saying not in final exam. And so all the remaining ones that are still, you know, at the high level folder, these are all the ones that we're going to go through, starting with the deuterostomes for exams, right? And also, I mentioned last time some final exam revision notes, so I put them in there, okay? This is just, remember, these are just notes in general. I can't possibly put every single thing in the notes. It's just like an outline of here's the topics that we looked at, okay? So anything that we covered in the lectures, and you know, part of the chapter, that chapter is you know, could potentially be in the exams, okay? If it's in that chapter, but we never talked about it in an exam, then that little section won't be included. Okay. So next question, I mentioned about doing a review session. Now my time is very, my time is very limited in the next several days. So I can do something on Friday evening. I know that's not going to suit everybody, but I'll record it. So, you know, and it's really just a sort of a review session saying, you know, if you got things that you're unclear about and I can remember the details, you know, I can give you some answers here. I've opened this up. Is that going? Okay. These are the times that I can manage on Friday. I'm sorry, that's a limited sort of selection, but, you know, I can start at 5, 6, 7, or 8, whatever makes people happiest, okay? Will you have office hours next week? Yes, I can do on Tuesday. Obviously, Thursday next week is no good. Office hours this week on Thursday, I have an appointment on Thursday afternoon, so I won't be able to do that, okay? Office hours this Thursday, but you can still email me and we can figure something out, okay? It's being recorded. Yes, this lecture is being recorded, and Friday night's session will be recorded. And Friday night is totally optional, right? It's totally up to you guys. I'll give you another. Okay, I've got 56 responses out of 154. So, you know, is this on iClicker? Yes. Okay, I've opened this up on iClicker. This is your question. This is your iClicker question, right? How long will the review be? as long as you guys want it right. It's going to be kind of in a way guided by you guys. It's really a sort of question and answer session where if you come with like, there was this bit on lecture so-and-so on slide 24, 24-hour review, probably not. So I'll just leave it, you know, it'll be sort of open-ended, okay? It's not going to be like an hour lecture or anything like that. It says no response. Okay, differently. Okay. Okay, when it gets to 100, I'll close it at that. We've got 97 responses right now. And okay, still a few answers coming in there. Okay, I'll shut that out. And what do we have? A, what's that? Friday, 5 p.m., okay? All of you are correct, whatever you said. Okay. Same, it says no response for me. Okay. Well, I think A was overwhelming anyway, okay? So it says no response. I was incorrect. Okay. Don't worry. There you go. Unable to answer the question. Okay. Well, don't. It's fine. Okay. Don't. It's one iClicker question, and I will probably exclude this one anyway, right? Because it's just a survey. Okay. So Friday 5 p.m. is what we're going to go with. Friday 5 p.m. Okay. Great. And I think what I'm going to do for the rest of this is I'm just going to close the iClicker down. Okay. End session. Yes. End class. Sabbath on well, yeah, Sabbath on Friday, and I know Monday. See, Monday and Tuesday are also Jewish holidays next week. It is recorded. Okay, so you can send if you have a problem, you can send in questions in advance that I can talk about, and I can go over them, and it will be recorded. You can look through them. Okay. Next is just want to say that you probably had emails, I'm assuming, about student reviews, you know, that you can do of all of us instructors. So just make sure you fill those in, make them, you know, emphasize the things that you really liked. If there are things you didn't like from the course, you know, say that as well, but say positive things about things that can, as in, do this, you know, this would have been better or something like that, because these are ways of us reading through these and sort of saying, oh yes, we can improve it that way. Okay. Can you give us 2 extra points towards that? Okay. So just do that. My name might appear on the reviews of the labs. Just review as if it's for your lab instructor. I shouldn't really be on those. And then you should get one for me for lectures and Dr. Spagnola as well. Okay. So if there's stuff that you loved, tell us that. If there's ways that you think we can improve, say that, and we can look at that and take that on board. Okay. Okay. Last time we were talking about species interactions, and we got onto this slide about competition. Okay. So competition is a negative interaction in which species overlap in the use of some limiting resource. So the fact that they're both competing for that limited resource means that they're going to have some kind of a negative effect upon one another, okay? So, and what I mean by resources is, your resource is some component of the environment that both of those species need in order to sort of thrive and survive and do well, such as food, obviously, water, perhaps if you're a plant, the light or space, to grow or to find mates or things like that. And if you have a limiting resource, it refers to those resources that are in short supply, often due to competition. So if you're competing for light, right, you need a certain amount of space to be able to occupy and compete for that. Now your niche or your niche, depending upon how you pronounce it, is the physical and biological conditions that you require for a species to grow and reproduce and survive. And you can think of that in terms of two types of niche. One of them is the so-called fundamental niche. This is the physical capabilities of it's anywhere that has conditions that are suitable for that species to be able to live if there were no other competitors there. If everybody else had got out the way, here is, you know, warm enough for me to survive and wet enough for me to be able to survive, etc. But often species might be reduced to a so-called realized niche. And this is means that it's restricted. It's a certain part of their fundamental niche that they've been restricted to due to competition. So other things that have driven them out of there that are perhaps better competitors in certain areas. So it's restricted to a certain realized niche. What gives us 2 points towards a foundry? And you can also sort of think of this, you know, last time we talked about this logistic model, and that over time a population doesn't increase forever exponentially. It comes up to some carrying capacity within its environment, okay? So we learned previously about this K value, the carrying capacity of the environment. And when you have a competitor, it somehow is going to impact upon this, right? Rather than you coming up to the carrying capacity, somehow something else might be competing for this space as well. We're trying to instantly complete the survey on Blackboard. Yeah, we're not getting 2 points for for this thing, okay? Okay, so a competitor is somehow infringing upon this carrying capacity of a species, okay? And so you can have competitive exclusion where one species completely dominates a limiting resource and excludes another. So in other words, a competitor would squeeze the species out of this entire carrying capacity that it might otherwise have. Or you might have some coexistence. Species coexist by competing for a shared limiting resource and somehow, you know, sort of partition that, and they can both sort of exist. So, you know, instead of this blue line coming up to K, perhaps it's coming up to a lower value down here because you're getting squeezed out a little bit, okay? And the way that that competition can be occurring can either be interference competition, where you have direct competition between species 1 and species 2. So maybe they fight for a resource or something like that. In the book, it talks about an example where two types of ants, a desert ant, a honeypot ant, that coexist and they compete with one another. And one of the ant species, it gets little stones and it blocks off the entrance to the other ones. And it doesn't kill them, but it's sort of, the other ant species has to sort of waste time, you know, clearing all these stones away, etc., while the other one's out, you know, happily feeding, etc. So that's a sort of direct competition. It's similar to, you know, within a species, if you were a stags fighting for females, for example, that's direct intraspecific competition. This is interspecific competition, where one species is directly impacting another. Or you can have exploitation competition, where you have some limiting resource and, you know, species 1 is eating that and species 2 is eating that or using that resource in some way. And so they might not be directly, you know, fighting with each other, for example, but nevertheless, they're affecting each other because, you know, this one eats all the food, and so now there's less food for this one, okay? But you might have resource partitioning that can lead to coexistence of competitors. If they're both able to somehow feed upon this or use them in alternate ways, or perhaps switch to other different alternative food sources. This is an example of that, showing competition with various types of paramecium species. So these are single-cell protists, which if you grow them in isolation, so this is one of the species grown by itself, the other species growing by itself, and then the third species. They go through this classical logistic growth model where you inoculate your petri dish or whatever it is with a small number. They reproduce rapidly, and then they approach that carrying capacity after time. Okay, each one of them will do that in isolation, although the carrying capacity is, see, it's slightly different. Here it's about 100, this one is about 200. If instead you grow these two species together, so here now you put the red species and the purple species together, you can see that they both start sort of taking off. So you put the red one in there and it starts to expand, and now you put the purple one in and it expands, and they're competing for the same food resource, but the red one is a better competitor. So it's excluding the other one, and eventually this one fades away, the purple one, because it can't compete. And the red one approaches the carrying capacity, although you notice it's lower here, it's about 150, it's lower than its original carrying capacity by itself, because these two are competing with one another. The other example is when you grow these two species together, the purple and the green one. Now these ones both come to a stable level, although lower than their original level, and that's because one of these species is able to switch its food source from bacterium to a yeast food source, and so they can both survive by partitioning the resources. Okay, but their carrying capacity of each one of these is lowered due to that competition. Competition can also lead to so-called character displacement. So if you're able to sort of partition your food resources, it can lead to changes at the individual level that are involved in that partitioning. A famous example of this is from so-called Darwin species, finches. So different species of finch birds that live on the Galapagos Islands. And some of these species occur in isolation on individual islands. So here, species 1 and species 2, they live allopatrically, so in other words, in isolation, on separate islands. And this is showing their beak dimensions, basically, their beak depth. And that beak is adapted to feed upon certain types of seeds and things like that. Okay, so on average, the mean beak size in isolation for the blue species here is about 9 or 10 millimeters depth. Okay, and the red species is pretty similar in isolation. However, on some islands or one island, they occur together, so sympatrically. And what you find is that the beak dimensions differ on this island. So the blue is different from when it occurs in isolation. The red is different from when it occurs in isolation. This has actually been shown to be a genetic effect. So it's an evolved difference between these two species. Their beak size diverges because they end up feeding upon two different food sources in here. So there's partitioning of that limiting resource. This is another great example of competition. So competition can be modified by the environment, and this is showing an example of the realized niche and the fundamental niche and how that can be modified. So this was a study done on Scottish intertidal barnacles, and in that area there are two main species in the shore. So in this area of the rocky shore, the tide comes in and goes out twice a day. And so these get exposed to air. And if you're at the top of the rocks, you're more exposed to an air environment. If you're at the bottom, you're more exposed to marine environment. And Semibalanus, one of the species, occurs in the lower portion here. Okay, that is its fundamental niche. It can live throughout this lower or most of the zone. The other species, Cathalamus, if you take everything else off the rocks and let it live wherever it wants to, it can live over this entire range, the full tidal range of these rocks. That is its fundamental niche. But in nature, what you find is it only occurs in this very top region up here. And that is because it is outcompeted by Semibalanus in the area where Semibalanus is able to live. Semibalanus cannot tolerate these desiccating conditions. So if you remove all the Cathalymus, Semibalanus will not live up here because it can't tolerate it. But Cathalymus is squeezed into this little area up here that it can tolerate because Semibalanus outcompetes it in the other areas of the shore. So competition is modified by the environment. Down here, Semibalanus is a better competitor. Up here, it can't compete, and so Cathalymus takes over. So competition refers to it has negative interactions. Both participants in competitions, species A and B, they both have negative effects upon them. Mutualism refers to where both species have some net benefit, so a positive effect upon them, okay? And sometimes this can be interlinked in a highly dependent manner. So this is a table just showing different types of positive interactions. There might either be symbiotic, so if you remember we were saying that's where one species is living on or in another species, or just non-symbiotic. They just occur in the same habitat together, okay? And what this obligate refers to means that an obligate symbiont means that they can only live in a symbiotic relationship, otherwise they cannot survive. Facultative indicates that they may live symbiotically or may not be. You know, if it's non-symbiotic, they can still survive. So examples of these positive interactions occur with plants and some types of fungi, for example, that can exchange nutrients between them. You can have all types of different combinations. Coral and the algae that live inside of them, that's a well-known example where you can either have obligate symbionts, bionts, or sometimes facultative. So when you get coral bleaching, for example, they might eject symbiotic algae inside of them. Lichens that you see growing on the rocks if you go walking out in the woods, an algae and fungi association. And some types of plants and insects, either with pollinating or dispersal of seeds, where you might have specific types of species A and species B that have to occur together for pollination to occur. So we talked about that Darwin's orchid and the moth, for example, that are specially evolved, one with respect to the other, for pollination, or in a facultative manner as well. So positive interactions are pretty much the opposite of competition, where both participants have a positive benefit instead of a negative benefit. Now, those positive interactions, just like competition, they might be modified by environmental conditions. This was an example from a paper in Nature in 2002, where they looked at alpine plants. And what they did was they sort of looked at if you grew different types of alpine plants in isolation or with other species with it. So they're occurring together or just by themselves. And what they found was that they looked at different locations around the world. And at high elevations, so where it gets very cold, etc., they found that when you grew these plants together, that there was a net positive benefit to the focal species they were looking at in terms of having better growth. Okay, now I'm not quite sure what the mechanism involved in that was, but they grew better. However, when you did the same experiment at low elevations and you put them all together so they grew in in a mixed community as opposed to a single species by themselves, they grew worse. So the environmental conditions that these were growing in modified, it changed from being competitive to mutualistic, depending upon whether you're at a high or a low elevation, essentially. There's one other video that I put in here showing mutualism. It's a video from the book. And I'm not sure if it's in the 12th edition actually, but this is from the 11th edition. It's about 2.5 minutes long, showing mutualistic associations between acacia ants and bullhorns, acacia trees in Costa Rica. Okay, so that's a nice little video to look through. And yeah, okay, end of species interaction. Hooray. Okay, we can move on to lecture next. Okay, so let me just close this down. Okay, that's not an iClicker question we're going to do, and I will open up the next lecture, which is okay, going to be chapter 55 on communities. Okay. Great. Okay, you should be able to see that. Okay, so chapter 55 on communities. So let's just take a step back and remind ourselves where we were. This is a slide again that I've used several times that was from one of the previous lectures. And an ecological community is an assemblage of interacting species that are all living together at the same place and time, okay? Remember, the ecosystem refers to, is this the last chapter on the final? No, we're going to do one more chapter, okay? The last chapter for the final will be the one on ecosystems, okay? Which is already on Blackboard, okay? Okay, so ecological communities. Remember, the ecosystem refers to the community plus the physical environment that it lives in. So we've just gone through species interactions, which kind of builds us up, because remember, ecology is a lot about different scales, okay, going from the individual through to the biosphere level. We've talked about species interactions, and now we're going to talk about the communities that these species are part of. So what is the spatial scale? You know, I was saying spatial scale is important in ecology. What is the spatial scale of a community? Well, in essence, it's very vague, okay? So it depends upon what your study, what your particular interest is. So essentially, if you're sort of a community biologist and studying a community, it's something that you essentially need to define as part of your study. You know, you might be interested in all the species living in a pitcher plant, okay? All the species living on a tree, all the species living in a desert, okay? So these are different scales. There's no hard and fast rule defining exactly what a community is. It's basically all the species occurring in whatever that ecosystem that you're specifically interested in. The other aspect in this, in studies of community ecology, is what does it mean by all the species? And again, there is some sort of vagueness as well, because in theory, you know, you might sort of say, well, it's all the species, but if you were studying all, you know, community biology of a desert, for example, I mean, that in theory would include all the bacteria that are living there, all the fungi that are living there, all, you know, everything in there, which would be, you know, literally impossible to study. Okay, it's too much. So often, you know, people might be interested in a subset of species. So, you know, all the microbes or all the insects or all the plants, for example, some group of organisms, as opposed to literally everything from, you know, bacteria through to elephants or something. Okay. So there's some vagueness involved here. So ecologists often restrict studies of communities to particular subsets due to the complexity of these systems. And that subset, you know, it could be something like, well, I'm going to study all the amphibians within a wetland community because I'm an amphibian, you know, biologist or something, or the fish on a coral reef, insects in a woodland. So there could be some sort of taxonomic affinity amongst those, okay? Another way of studying organisms in a community might be to think of an interest in guilds. So a guild is a group of species that use a similar resource. And they might be, you know, belong to different taxonomic groups. So for example, you might be interested in animals that feed on pollen that could consist of, you know, bats and birds and bees, etc. Or algal grazers on a rocky shore that might involve, you know, echinoderms and mollusks, etc. So some sort of group of organisms, possibly from mixed taxonomic groups that have some similar resource that they're using. And another way of dividing them would be in terms of functional groups. So for example, you might be interested in nitrogen fixing plants, and because they're performing a specific function within the ecosystem where they're fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and making it available within soil to, you know, other primary producers, or decomposers, things that are recycling those nutrients within the environment. Okay, so taxonomic affinity, guilds or functional groups are some of the ways in which you can sort of break these communities down. Communities can also be given some kind of a organization as well. So a lot of this is basically trying to sort of give some system and order to these really complex situations. Mix of lots and lots of different species potentially. So food webs are a way of showing trophic connections among species. So remember, trophic means some feeding association where one is deriving nutrients from another one. And it's important because it's showing some kind of, you know, form of energy flow through the system. And you can divide these into different trophic levels based upon, you know, how high or low up in the food chain they may be. So, you know, at the bottom, you've got here your primary producers that are photosynthetic and changing sunlight energy into sugars and, you know, carbohydrates that are energy rich that then provide nutrients and energy for the rest of the community. Primary producers that are feeding upon, primary consumers that are feeding upon these primary producers. So for example, you know, bison eating grass and elk eating grass, etc. These things. Secondary consumers that are then consuming these primary producers, and tertiary consumers, so, you know, carnivorous things that are feeding upon animals lower down in the food chain. And then also omnivores, some that might be a mix of all of these, you know, feeding on multiple trophic levels, such as, for example, you know, this coyote that's feeding on berries, but it's also, you know, feeding on elk, for example. And then not shown within this is also the fact that you've got things that are then cycling back down again here as well. So detritivores, things that consume detritus, which is waste products from dead organisms, such as earthworms and termites, for example, that might be consuming dead leaves or dead trees. Other, you know, things that might be consuming animal products as well. Decomposers break down detritus by absorbing nutrients through external chemical and biological processes. So that's things like bacteria and fungi, okay, that are also breaking down some of these products and making those nutrients available again within the soil in this instance to these primary producers. And then scavengers, things that eat larger dead organisms. So in this system, it's talking about, you know, ravens. These are the dotted lines. Ravens, bald eagles, bears that might feed on carrion and things like that as well. Okay, so they're essentially breaking these down into simpler components that then their feces can be broken down by these things, etc. As all part of that nutrient cycling. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about community structure here, and we're going to talk about diversity. So we've sort of used the term diversity a little bit loosely in some of the previous lectures. And you know, when you think of diversity, often people think about, well, how many species are there? That's my what I'm talking about as diversity. But strictly speaking, that's species richness. How many different species occur within a community? Species diversity takes into effect also species evenness. So it's not just a measure of how many different species that you have, okay? So the richness is the number of species, the evenness is the relative abundance of those different species. So in this example here that comes from the book, it's showing, I think there are 20 individuals here in this community, and there are 4 species, you know, green frog, other frog, other frog, and other frog, okay? So you've got 4 different species, but there's only one individual of 3 of the species and all the rest of the green frogs. Whereas in a higher diversity community, you've got the same number of species, okay, 4 frog species, but they are more evenly distributed, okay? You've got a more equal number of them, and this would result in higher diversity. So how do we define diversity? One way of doing it is using a diversity index. And there's actually a whole slew of these different indices that people use that can measure different components of different ways of measuring this diversity basically within a system. This is an example of one of the sort of most commonly used. It's called the Shannon index, referred to by this H index here. And in the next few slides, I'm going to just sort of illustrate how this index works, how you would calculate it. You don't have to remember this exact formula, but you need to understand, you know, what are these different components are and how you might use them and interpret the diversity that you can get from this index. So what are we seeing in this formula? So H is a number, which is your Shannon index. Basically, the higher it is, it means the higher your diversity within your community that you're interested in. How do we calculate it? It consists of, let's first of all consider this, this PI, okay? This is the proportion. It's saying for species I, so you've got species I equals 1 through to S, however many species. If you've got 10 species in your system, you know, it'd be species 1, species 2, species 3, up to species 10, okay? So let's start with species 1. It's the proportion of individuals in the I species within your community times the natural logarithm of PI. So that's 2.71 something to the power of whatever that power of is. So it's like a log function. So it's the proportion times the natural logarithm of that proportion, and you calculate that for each species. Species 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 through species 10, or however many you've got. And then this sigma here means that's the sum of. So you add them all together, okay? And that gives you a number. It'll actually give you a negative number because the natural logarithm of a proportion would be negative. So at the end, it's all multiplied by 0, by minus 1, just to make it a positive value. And that is your diversity index, okay? I'll show you in a second how you might go through calculating that. But one of the complicated things about interpreting these many diversity indices is that they're non-linear. So depending upon the type of community that you have, going through, you know, one species up to, you know, 1,000 species I did in this graph. This is slightly different from the one I put on Blackboard. But this is showing you the highest possible H you could possibly get with a different number of species in the community. If everything was evenly distributed, if all the species were exactly evenly distributed, that would give you the maximum diversity in the system. And you can see that it's non-linear. So as you go up in species numbers, you know, it's not, you don't just go up like more and more diverse in a linear fashion. It sort of plateaus out. Okay, so it can be tricky to interpret, and that's one of the reasons why there are different types of diversity indices. So it's non-linear and can be tricky to interpret in that sense, but essentially, the higher your H value, the higher your diversity. So how do we go about calculating diversity? This is an example, okay? So we'll go back to this frog example where we have 20 individuals in a community, 4 different species, but there's only one representative of 3 of those species. So here we've got species 1, species 2, or toad, okay, frog toads, species 3, species 4. This is their abundance, and this is the proportion of those individuals in the community. So the proportion there, 0.85, is 17 divided by 20. Proportion for species 2 is 1 divided by 20, etc. Okay. This column here is showing the natural logarithm of this proportion. And this column here is this value times this value for species 1. This one is that value times that value for species 2, etc. Okay. And at the end, all it's doing is adding these all together, summing them across the different species to give you this number here, minus 0.589. Okay. Now, if you remember, the equation here has got a negative there, so that negative transfers to a positive when we look at our diversity index of H. And in this instance, the challenge index is 0.5989. Now, if instead we had a system where these were all equally distributed, 5 individuals of each species, these are the numbers that would come out from that. So proportion of species 1, that's 0.25 of the individuals in the community will be species 1, same for species 2, etc. Take the natural logarithm, add the products all together, we get a minus 1.388, but we multiply it by minus 1. So our index there is 1.388. So even though we have the same number of species in this system, we have a higher diversity because they are more evenly distributed. Okay. Now, what we've talked about there was quantifying species diversity. Okay. But the term biodiversity is more, it encompasses a greater range of factors. So when we talk about biodiversity, it is looking at community diversity. So in other words, a species diversity that we've just discussed. But biodiversity also includes, for example, genetic biodiversity. So for example, you take a population of a species and look at its genome. Now, if you had something that was cloned and every single individual in the population was exactly the same as the other one genetically, you'd obviously have very, very, very low diversity. But the more alleles that you have on a particular locus of the genome within the population, the higher the genetic diversity is within that population, okay? And then that is the same for species number 2 and species number 3, etc. Okay, so genetic diversity is important, and it can help populations adapt to different conditions or changes in conditions. We've got the community diversity we've talked about before, but also there is the ecosystem or the regional diversity. So, for example, here, in this picture, we're seeing, a rocky shore, for example. You're going to have a rocky shore community, but you've got different landscapes. Okay, so there's a terrestrial diversity amongst all of that. There's the subtidal marine diversity. So, that's building upon all of these different types of communities. So biodiversity encompasses all of these different scales, different levels that we've talked about, which is often, the scaling is often important in ecology. And this is actually encompassed in some legal language. If you go to, for example, to the 1992 United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which was sort of an agreement that came to in 92 in Rio in Brazil. It says biological diversity means, and as part of this, it says includes diversity within species, so that's the genetic biodiversity, between species, so that's this level, and of ecosystems, okay? That's this level here. Different levels of diversity, all making up this, this biodiversity. Okay, so what actually controls community membership? If you remember, we were talking about communities being all the different species in a habitat that are interacting with one another. And what we see is those species living there, how, what controls what species are in that area. There are different sort of filters, you can think of them, conceptual filters of what might be controlling that membership. And the first of all is the species supply. So in other words, just regional species pools that are available with an area, okay? So as an example, in some of the previous lectures, we talked about how different phylogenetic groups of organisms break down by sort of continent or landmass areas. And that's because over geological time, species have been physically separated from one another and then evolved in separate directions. And there was restricted movement at some points between different areas. So, a community in Africa might not be able to be the same as a community in some other far-flung place that it hasn't been connected to for a long time, simply because there's no way that those organisms can access that community. The next sort of conceptual filter is this abiotic factors. So the physical and chemical environment of the conditions that occur in a particular ecosystem. So this is really sort of part of that concept of the fundamental niche of an organism. If there's a range of conditions that it can tolerate, for example, that semi-balanus barnacle in intertidal zone that we talked about, if conditions are within the range that it can tolerate, it could possibly occur within that area. But, you're not going to find that barnacle in a desert, even if it could get there. So even if it had gone through the species supply thing, simply because there's no way that that barnacle can survive within a desert. It's not adapted to it. So abiotic means, physical and chemical habitat conditions, as opposed to biotic, which refers to biological factors, okay? Which takes us on to the third conceptual filter, which is this biotic factors. So biology, basically, the interaction between species, including humans, okay? So if you remember, when you have interactions, if you have competition, you can have negative effects upon one another. And if one species is able to outcompete another and get rid of it, essentially, then that poor competitor is not going to go through this filter, and it won't occur within the community. So biotic factors and controlling community membership, they can occur through species interactions and trophic cascades, okay? So one of the ways that this can occur is a direct interaction where species A has a direct interaction with species B and essentially eliminates it from the system. But you can also have indirect interactions where species A maybe has some effect on species B, and species B has some direct effect on species C, and therefore A can influence C, but not through a direct interaction here, okay? It's acting indirectly through species B. So a famous example of that comes from the different conditions that have occurred in Yellowstone National Park, okay, where you have trophic cascades, where the rate of consumption of one trophic level results in a change of species abundance or composition at a lower trophic level. So this graph here is showing the number of elk occurring within the park at different points in time from 1900 through to near day, modern day. Now, from 1926 onwards, they kept records of elk numbers, and prior to that time, there were wolves within the system. Okay, they didn't record the elk numbers, but wolves are predators on elk. After a while, wolves got eliminated. There was actually a government program to eliminate wolves from many areas of the United States. So that natural predator on elk was eliminated, but hunting was still allowed on there. So hunters would go out and shoot elk, and their numbers remained relatively stable, or even sort of started to go down because there was still essentially predation upon them, but predation coming from humans. But in 1968, hunting in Yellowstone Park was banned, and so both of these predation sources were removed, and so those numbers increased of elk, okay, not elves, elk, because there's nothing killing them essentially. And then in 1995, due to public pressure, wolves were reintroduced, but there's no hunting allowed on the wolves or the elk, but then their numbers decreased because these wolves were now natural predators on them again. Okay, so a direct interaction between predation and prey, predation either being natural or from humans. Now, there were other effects that were recorded within the system, and one of those was on beavers. So more wolves resulted in less elk, and elk feed upon, amongst other things, willow trees, okay? And those willow trees are used by beavers. So more willow trees by the streams led to more beavers which eat the willow. So there was an indirect interaction between the wolf and the beaver, not because the wolf were eating or predating or anything like that, the beaver, but because the wolves were impacting elk numbers, which impact the vegetation, which then impacts the beaver numbers. So an indirect interaction upon them. So there's this whole cascade, a knock-on effect where you change one thing and it's changing something else downstream in the system, perhaps something that you wouldn't even expect to see occurring, but actually has these complex links, cascades through the system. So how is species diversity maintained when species are competing with one another? And part of this comes from the sort of thought that if you have strong competitors for resources, and resources are limiting, this should lead to the exclusion of weak competitors. So why don't poor competitors always go extinct? Why are they still within the system if they're being outcompeted by better competitors? One of the reasons is that in a changing environment, so environmental conditions aren't always exactly the same all the time, year in, year out, you know, season to season, year to year, decade to decade, okay? Conditions are dynamic. The ecosystem is dynamic because the physical conditions, or potentially the chemical conditions, are not stable. And so in a changing environment, no species is necessarily the best competitor under all conditions. You can't be best at everything. If you evolve and adapt to be a strong competitor under one set of conditions, and then those conditions change, it's likely that you're no longer the best competitor. So if an extreme physical event occurs, or if conditions are changing, then you're not always the best competitor, okay? So those poor competitors actually turn out to be good competitors in some conditions. Resource mediated. Okay, so yeah, in an extreme physical event, impact strong competitors, poor competitors gain access to limiting resources. So, and this is referred to as resource mediated coexistence under these dynamic conditions that may exist. Now, this intermediate disturbance hypothesis captures this essentially. And what it's saying is it's a sort of a prediction or a hypothesis that basically says that you get the highest level of species diversity under some intermediate level of disturbance within the ecosystem. So if you can imagine a system at this end of the horizontal axis, where it has infrequent and mild disturbances. So in other words, it's a very, very stable environment, not dynamic at all. Well, there you might get lower species diversity because something that is well adapted, a good competitor under whatever those conditions are, is going to start to outcompete some of those other species, okay? At the intermediate here, you've got some kind of disturbance within the system. Maybe conditions change from year to year or something like that. And therefore, different species have a different chance of being the good competitor or a good competitor within the system. And that allows them to also exist. And then at the other end of the scale, you might have, you know, if every single year, you know, your field got wiped out by a lava, you know, a volcanic eruption or something like that, you know, nobody's going to do well under extreme and frequent disturbance, and so your diversity is going to go back down again. Okay, so this is a sliding scale of disturbance or stress within the system. The hypothesis, this intermediate disturbance hypothesis, predicts that sort of at intermediate levels you'll have higher diversity because you've got different species being good competitors under a range of conditions. So different species can have different effects within a community, and some of them can have sort of key and fundamental and strong effects upon the community structure. We've discussed this keystone species aspect before. This is where you have a species that is not necessarily dominant in terms of its numerically within the system, but it has a disproportionately large effect on the community structure, such as the example we talked about sea stars being a keystone species because they predate bivalves that would otherwise eliminate all the other species by just sort of, you know, dominating the rocky shore. We just talked about that example of wolves in Yellowstone Park that have a cascading effect upon elk and species that they influence. And we talked previously about sea otters on the West Coast, which are, you know, not necessarily the most dominant or numerical species in the system, but they eat those sea urchins, which then scrape away at giant kelp. So when you have no otters, you have lots of urchins. That eliminates all the giant kelp, which is then habitat, structural habitat for, you know, lots and lots of different sort of invertebrate and vertebrate species. So this is another example of a keystone species. You can also have a foundation species. Okay, a foundation species is something that has a larger effect on the community because, not despite of, but because of their large abundance or their large size. An example of this is these fig trees you get in tropical forests. And the way that they work is, you have a tree that might grow somewhere in a tropical forest, and these fig trees essentially grow around another tree with this sort of like network of system growing around it, and they eventually kill that tree that's inside of it and take over, and you're left behind with this sort of the fig tree that's got this incredible sort of structure to it that then becomes a habitat and provides resources for all sorts of other organisms within the system. So it provides physical habitat for all sorts of insects and birds and reptiles and things like that, and lots of fruit, which is important for bats and parrots and toucans, etc. So this single species or group of species, fig trees, has a really massive effect upon the biodiversity and the community structure within these tropical forests because of their large size, basically, with these things and their abundance as well. Another way in which a species can have a really major effect upon community structure and the ecosystem as a whole are species that you might refer to as being ecosystem engineers. Now, these can be foundation species or keystone species, so they're not mutually exclusive, these. The key component or part of an ecosystem engineer is an organism that creates or significantly modifies the habitat in some way. So good examples of this are beavers, for example. They have a really big effect upon their ecosystem because they build these dams, which then creates lakes behind them and then associated wetlands in these areas upstream of the dam. And so they create a whole new type of habitat there that wouldn't exist at all if you didn't have these beavers. The ecosystem engineers, they're changing the whole ecosystem. Another example are oyster reefs. So this is a picture of an intertidal oyster reef. They create these calcareous, shell reefs that then provide lots of different habitat for things to live in them. Fish use them, invertebrates use them, etc. Species that wouldn't be there otherwise unless those reefs were there. Coral reefs are obviously another fantastic example of something that would be an ecosystem engineer. Now, actually, in New York Harbor, this is an interesting example because oyster reefs used to be a major sort of component of New York Harbor. There were, in the 1900s, almost 250,000 acres of oyster reefs, but they got destroyed over time partly through harvesting and then also through pollution as well. They provide a lot of 3D structure for fish habitat, etc. And also they have a big impact upon the water quality as well, because these oysters, they filter, each oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water a day, takes suspended solids from them, it changes the nutrient levels in them, etc. So that changes the whole ecosystem. And now you may well have heard of this Billion Oyster Project. There's a big effort to try and replant oysters in these areas and try and build up these historic oyster reefs again. And they also provide protection from storm surge, for example, during hurricanes, etc. So we talked about when you have one species that can outcompete another species, or how that may change dynamically due to changing conditions, etc. But what happens when you have equal competitors? How is species diversity maintained if species A is just as good as species B? We talked earlier on about the resource partitioning, about, that's perhaps one way in which species can coexist. But another way is that there's also a chance component to it. This is a sort of so-called lottery model, or a neutral model. And the theory on this is relatively new and still is a developing area of community ecology that people are sort of, they haven't fully resolved yet, basically. But the general idea is that there is some kind of element of chance to something as well. In that when a resource becomes available, like say a tree falls down in a forest, for example, there's an open area that suddenly is available. One of the things that can control what might live there is just what happens to be the first thing to invade that new that resource that's become available. That allows it to become established, and now it can outcompete other things that might have come in and have done just as well if they were given the advantage or chance, but they didn't get there first. So maybe they got, this one got there first by chance. Maybe its seeds were just there at the right time of year when the thing happened, something like that. So there's an element of chance. Once you sort of take over an area, then you can dominate it. And that can be occurring, in lots of different areas across a coral reef, for example, where a space becomes available, somebody gets there, and then they outcompete if they are a good competitor. And that may allow different species to exist within the community. Communities can also change over time. They're not fixed elements necessarily. They're dynamic, and they change according to conditions. Remember, we were talking about those 3 conceptual filters that can affect community composition, the species pool available to an area, abiotic factors and biotic factors. Now, those different factors, those different filters may change over time. So, for example, disturbance is one abiotic factor that can change over time. So succession, meaning changes in community composition over time. So disturbance that maybe injures or kills some individuals. It can either be a minor or localized disturbance, or something major and catastrophic, such as a volcanic eruption or a hurricane or something like that, that can change community composition. Stress can also be something that changes community composition over time. Okay, so would a coral reef also be considered a foundation species? Yes. Well, the coral, yes, the corals that make up the coral reef, yes, are foundation species since other species live within them. Yes, coral reefs are a foundation species, although there's normally quite a variety of different corals that make up that coral reef, but yes, they're foundation species. So here's an example of how stress may change community composition over time. This is an example here showing, so on the y-axis, this is a study on birds, North American bird species and their winter range. Okay, and what it's showing is it's shifted over time since the 1960s due to changing climate conditions in general, warming conditions. And so the average distance moved north that these species have undergone has changed. They basically can inhabit more northerly areas than they could do 50, 60, 70 years ago, because of changing in abiotic conditions or stress. Okay, so this is the average distance moved north. They've moved about 40 miles north. So you're changing the communities at these different latitudes due to different environmental conditions. You're changing the fundamental niche, essentially, of these species. Also, species interactions can cause successions of communities. And this is most dramatically seen when you have some sort of a new species that arrives within an area that can take over. So an invasive species that might be introduced perhaps by humans, for example. Zebra mussels is a good example of this, that invaded the Hudson River in the 1990s from ship ballast water. And that change resulted in a huge change in phytoplankton and zooplankton within the system, because these zebra mussels, they filter lots and lots of water, and they're filtering phytoplankton and zooplankton out of it. And these became very, very dominant within the system. The native pearly mussels almost disappeared because they were outcompeted by these zebra mussels. And also fish composition changed. For example, open water species such as shad and herring, their numbers declined, partly because they live on this plankton here, and also because they have planktonic eggs themselves that are filtered out by these mussels. Whereas other types of littoral fish, so that means fish that live along the shore, in shore areas, such as sunfish, they increase. Now, sunfish have benthic eggs that they lay in nests and look after on the seabed. So they're not being filtered out of the water column by these mussels. So that gave them a chance, that was advantageous for them with respect to these other species that have planktonic eggs. A really great example of succession of communities is a study done in Glacier Bay in Alaska of so-called primary succession of communities. This is when disturbance kills the entire community, and then when that disturbance is removed, the community changes over time. So in Glacier Bay, the glacier has been retreating over time due to warming conditions in the area. So in 1750, the glacier came all the way out to this area here. In modern times, where's the latest one here, 1994, there it is, the sort of tip of the glacier is all the way back here. So this used to be all covered by glacier, and now it has been exposed. And so previously there was nothing living here on these rocks, etc., terrestrial organisms, because they had a great big glacier sitting on top of them. And what's nice about this study is that you have this sort of, gradation. We know that this has been released from ice the longest period of time, this is the most recent, and these in between. So you can see the changes in community that have occurred across this time zone. So the glacier has been retreating for at least 200 years. Areas free of ice at different times during the retreat show succession of communities. And the initial species that occur, so when the ice has first disappeared, you get these pioneering species that move into the area. Okay, this is actually a short video. Let's see how we're doing for time. I will leave you to watch this one at home, but it explains that succession of species. So a number of these, and in the next lecture as well, I've put in there links to what I've described as home videos. Okay. 129. I'll just do a couple more slides here. Okay. Essentially, what that video is showing you is that over time, initially you get some pioneering plants that move in here. You have some bacteria and fungi that break down, that colonize the rocks that are initially left behind, and they help break down some of those rocks into sort of smaller components that then allow small pioneer plants to move in, and particularly those that are nitrogen fixers with these nodules in their roots, etc. Because the soil is such poor condition. And over time, those pioneer plants that can thrive in those poor conditions, they grow, bits of them break down, etc., and the rock's breaking down more. the soil condition improves as a result of that, and other species can start to move in. So the next species that comes in is the elders, which are also nitrogen fixers. And eventually you get transition as the soil gets better and better condition due to these pioneer species and things that can do well in poor conditions, until eventually you get spruce trees that move in when conditions are suitably improved, and they outcompete all of these other ones and essentially take over. And these are the so-called climax species. So those that are kind of like the end result, long-term results, unless some you know, other big disturbance arrives. And this is showing what's happening, the bottom graph, to the nitrogen composition of these areas over time. So the nitrogen levels gradually going up and up as you got these nitrogen fixers, etc. And then when you get this transition stage, you get breakdown of leaves, etc. Nitrogen goes up, and eventually you get the climax species that are going to come in and use some of that resource. So a transition that occurs over time. Okay. And we're doing pretty well on this, and the last lecture is shorter than this one, deliberately. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take up with secondary succession on Thursday, which will be our last lecture. We will also go through chapter 56, which is ecosystems. That will be the final chapter that we cover for the final exams. Okay, great. And there will be no iClicker on Thursday. Okay, so we're in good shape. We're doing fine. What do we have? We have office hours later this afternoon if you need them, but I will not be available Thursday. If you do need me, send me, you know, at some other special time. If that doesn't suit you, drop me an email and we can meet. And then we'll meet on Friday, 5 p.m. Okay, great. And check out Blackboard for revision notes, and PowerPoint for Thursday is already up there. Have a good day. Thank you very much.
Professor?
Yes. Hi, you just gone on mute there.
Oh, the iClicker, I'm sorry, the Achieve for 50% our grade, is that based on completion or the grade we got on it?
Sorry, say that again.
The assignments on Achieve, that's 15% of our grade, correct?
Well, the assignments plus the iClicker, but the majority of that will be the assignments. Yes.
And that's based on the grade book?
15% of your grade.
Or is that on completion? Is it based on the scores we received on it, or is it based on completion?
The scores, but your lowest assignment score will be dropped, and your lowest 3 iClickers will be dropped.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay.
Professor, hello.
Hi.
Hi, I want to go to your office hours. Should I email you about it?
No, just turn up. You're talking about at 2 o'clock?
Yes.
Just turn up. So if I don't let you straight in, it's either because somebody is, you know, I'm already speaking to somebody. I don't know if you can see that in the waiting room, but sometimes, and I don't know why, sometimes I'm there on Zoom and I don't see somebody coming to the waiting room. I get a notification sometimes in an email like, oh, somebody's in the waiting room, but I look on Zoom and I don't see it. So I close down Zoom and I reopen it, and there they are. So if you think you're in that situation, drop me an email saying I'm in the waiting room, and then I can double check. Okay, it might be because I'm already speaking to somebody, or it might be just because for some reason it's not showing. I don't see you in the waiting room for, I don't know, for reasons I don't understand. So okay.
Okay, I'll join later and see what's. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I see somebody said, is the final next Tuesday? No, look at the syllabus. It says Thursday, May 20th at 11 a.m. Okay. Final is the 20th. Shira Cohen, lower hand.
Hi,
Lower
how are
hand.
you?
Yeah, good, thank you.
I failed the lab practical. Do you think there will be a curve?
So we evaluate that right at the very end. So what we do is, we get all the different lab sections together, and only at that point can we sort of say, because like say in one of the groups the average score is 90% and the other group the other average score is 60%. Well, it's obviously just depends what group you're in, and so we even that out. But we can't say exactly how things will be curved until we have everything, all the grades from all the different sections, from everything together at in the final mix, basically. So
Okay, thank you so much.
okay. Facts, terrible. Do you curve if it's like 90? Like I said, I can't tell you how the curving will they lowered people's grades by 8%. Would you do the same? I don't know. I honestly can't tell you how the curving will occur until we have everything together, right? So he said, no, okay. So, we'll see, and we have a meeting with all the instructors together, etc. So we'll see, okay? But I can't tell you how the curving will work right now, I'm sorry. Okay, what is the final chapter covered in the exam? Okay, so look on Blackboard, I've made it clear in there, but the final chapter will be chapter 56. We will not do chapter 57 on changing biosphere, okay? But if you go into Blackboard, let me have a look in Blackboard. Go in Blackboard under the lecture section. Everything is organized there and exactly what will be in the exam or what will be not, including lecture revision notes. How will each section on the exam be divided? How will each section? You mean like which, so there'll be test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4. Which lectures will be in each test? Is that what you mean, Michaela? Yes. I will let you know in advance. I will probably give it some structure like last time, but it probably won't be as structured as test 1 equals chapter A and B, etc. It'll probably, I think last time test 1 and 2 was all of Dr. Spagnolo's, test 3 and 4 was all of mine. It'll probably be arranged in that kind of, so test 1 and 2 will probably do one batch of chapters, and test 3 and 4 will probably do another batch of chapters. But I will let you know, okay? I'll actually just make a note of that, okay? So it'll be some structure, but not completely structured, okay? Okay. Any other questions while folks are there? Thank you, Professor, for being patient with us. Okay. I try and be patient. I hope I'm good. Thanks very much. Okay, great. How many? We've got 14 people here. So unless somebody else speaks up now or puts a comment in, I will head out and I'll be available for office hours in 20 minutes or so. Okay, gives me 20 minutes to have my lunch. Okay, bye.